Dr. George Frederick Clark, dentist and author, avocational archaeologist and historian, wrote the first book-length work devoted largely to the pre-contact archaeology of New Brunswick, and was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of New Brunswick in 1969. In 2007, his collection of 2,700 artifacts and associated notes and records was donated to the University of New Brunswick by the Clark family. Dr. Clark's archaeological activities coincided with a time when little professional archaeological work was being conducted in the province, and many of the sites that he found and explored were subsequently submerged beneath the head ponds of hydroelectric dams. Dr. Clark's later publications are unique in their interweaving of fishing and archaeology with memoir and the maritime storytelling tradition. His work is important for its potential contributions to the history of Canadian archaeology, and the Clark collection may shed light on the portage routes between the St. John, Tobic, St. Croix, and Miramichi river systems, which span the traditional territories of the Wolastoqiyik, the Pestamacatiac, and the Mi'kmaq. This presentation is an updated version of a paper I presented at the 2008 Canadian Archaeological Association meeting at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. Before I go on, I wish to thank the Clark family for donating Dr. Clark's artifact collection to the University of New Brunswick. In particular, I thank Stephen Homer, Dr. Clark's grandson, Mary Bernard, Dr. Clark's granddaughter, and David Miles, an executor of the Clark estate, who first approached UNB about the donation. I also wish to thank the following colleagues and students for their contributions to the work I'm reporting here: Susan Blair, Drew Gilbert, Liz Gorman, Brian Campbell, Cora Woolsey, Ann Thornton, Joy Cummings, Rob Blanchard, and Greg Campbell. The acquisition of the Clark collection was arranged and funded by UNB. I thank the offices listed here for their assistance: the Arts Faculty, Research Services, Donor Relations, and the University Secretariat. In particular, I thank Dr. James S. Murray, Professor of Classics and former Dean of Arts at UNB. None of this would have been possible without his support and enthusiasm. Dr. George Frederick Clark was born in 1883 and died in 1974. Dentistry was Dr. Clark's day job from the turn of the century to the early 1950s. However, from an early age, his main ambition was to become a writer. During his life, Dr. Clark authored a substantial and varied body of published work, including novels, historical fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and children's literature. Clark was an outdoorsman and an avid sports fisherman. Two of his books are centered on salmon fishing. Fishing and archaeology were often intertwined in his life and in his writing. Clark was also what we would now call an environmental activist. During the last decade of his life, he campaigned against the construction of hydroelectric dams on the St. John River. He was concerned, as it turns out justifiably, about the negative effects of the dams on fishing and on the archaeological record. The photo on the left shows Clark at an excavation in the Meductic site during the run-up to the building of the Mactaquac Dam. Dr. Clark was an avocational historian and archaeologist. He conducted archaeological research, surface collecting, and excavations from the 1920s to the 1960s. As is often the case with avocational archaeologists, it was finding things that gave him the greatest pleasure and satisfaction. Apparently, he found his first pre-contact artifact as a teenager while duck hunting on the Maquapit French Lake thoroughfare. The photo on the right shows Clark, late in his life, with Dr. David Sanger during the excavation of the Cow Point Archaic Cemetery on the Grand Lake thoroughfare. It was an assemblage of artifacts that Clark found while repairing the foundation of a fishing camp near Juniper in the 1920s that really sparked his lifelong interest in archaeology and in the First Nations people of New Brunswick. Clark's book, Someone Before Us, published in 1968, is an ambitious and somewhat rambling book that includes prose, verse, and photographs. The content is part memoir and part history, touching on the Norse, the Acadians, and others. However, the content always circles back to Native people and to pre-contact sites and artifacts. I believe I'm justified in referring to Someone Before Us as the first book-length publication that deals in large part with New Brunswick prehistory. In 1969, the University of New Brunswick awarded Dr. Clark an honorary doctorate in recognition of his historical and archaeological work. Clark's warmth, his passion and perceptiveness, his love for New Brunswick, and his respect for Native culture and heritage come through powerfully in his writing. In addition to his other accomplishments, Clark was also an educator. He devoted considerable effort to interpreting found objects brought to him and to introducing others, especially young people, to the mysteries and fascinations of archaeological finds. Thus, it is not surprising that Clark hoped that his collection would eventually be housed in a public institution where it could be used for educational purposes. In 2007, the Clark family donated the collection to UNB. In the years since, the Department of Anthropology has employed the collection for research and to teach local and regional archaeological history, consistent with Dr. Clark's wishes. The George Frederick Clark Artifact Collection consists of about 2,700 pieces. Most of these are complete, or are substantial portions of formal tools. Dr. Clark sometimes made notes about finding lithic debitage, but rarely collected it. Both historic and prehistoric artifacts are included. Many of the historic artifacts are from the 18th century Malicete French occupation at Meductic. The bulk of the collection consists of pre-contact stone tools, many of which appear to be archaic in age, that is, dating between about 3,000 and 8,000 years ago. Ceramic, organic, and fiber artifacts are present in smaller numbers. Currently, portions of the Clark collection are on display at the L.P. Fisher Library in Woodstock, shown here, and at the Atlantic Salmon Museum in Doketown. The Salmon Museum's main interest in Clark's work centers on his contributions to fly fishing in the Maritimes. Part of their display is shown here. Most of the artifacts in the Clark collection are from west central New Brunswick. However, there are a few artifacts from Western Canada and from the Midwestern and Southeastern United States. Clark appears to have been fairly meticulous about keeping provenance information associated with these foreign artifacts to prevent them from being confused with those he found in New Brunswick. It seems likely that he traded New Brunswick artifacts in order to acquire some of the foreign ones. And we know that Dr. Clark sometimes gave away artifacts to fishing guides, for example, and perhaps to those who helped him excavate sites. Part of the collection is also on display at the George Frederick Clark Archaeological Teaching Laboratory at UNB, shown here. Susan Blair and I are in the initial stages of working with the collection. We see the Department of Anthropology's role as compiling and analyzing information pertaining to the Clark collection, stewarding the collection for the future, developing its teaching potential, developing its research potential, and we plan to expand and maintain public display and interpretation opportunities for the collection. This work began in 2008 when we had students enrolled in the Honors Archaeology course research a selection of artifacts from the Clark collection. The results of their work were summarized in a poster displayed at the student poster session in the 2008 Canadian Archaeological Association meeting. In most subsequent years, honor students have created additional posters, displays, and research papers on various aspects of the collection. By now, some of you may be wondering how canoes and portages figure into all of this. Among the other things I've recounted, Dr. Clark was a canoe aficionado. The photo on the left shows him with Dr. Peter Paul, the well-known Aboriginal elder and historian from the Woodstock First Nation, repairing a bark canoe. Clark possessed several full-size canoes, both bark boats and dugouts, made using traditional techniques. Parenthetically, I should mention that UNB awarded an honorary doctorate to Peter Paul in 1970, the year after Dr. Clark received this honor. Dr. Clark also possessed several canoe models made by Edwin Tappan Adney, the well-known historian of Aboriginal boat technologies. Tappan Adney lived at Woodstock for many years. He and Dr. Clark shared common interests in boats, native cultures, and the outdoor life. Clark tried, apparently without much success, to interest Tappan Adney in archaeology. Several years ago, the Clark family donated both the full-size boats and the boat models to the Canadian Museum of Civilization, now the Canadian Museum of History. Dr. Clark published Tappan Adney's description of birch bark canoe making in Someone Before Us. Tappan Adney's work has been the subject of several books in recent years. Here is an illustration from one of these books showing his model of a Maliseet canoe. The full-channeled stone gouge showed at the right dates to the Archaic period. Artifacts like this one bear a resemblance to dugout canoes. And since some archaeologists believe that gouges were used specifically for dugout canoe making, it's tempting to consider these artifacts as, in part, symbolic representations of boats. Dr. Clark's archaeological work connects to the study of native watercraft in another way, as a function of the area where he undertook most of his collecting and excavations. The dotted line on this map outlines that area, which includes the central St. John River Valley and portions of the adjacent watersheds. It is there that the major river systems of New Brunswick most closely approach one another, and thus this is an important nexus for east-west travel along canoe portage routes. It seems likely that various aspects of the Clark collection, for example distributions of lithic materials, will shed light on the use histories of these portages, and I illustrate only a few of the portage routes here. The most famous of the canoe portage routes is the Maliseet Trail, on the west side of the St. John River, a series of water routes and portages connecting the St. John to the St. Croix and Penobscot watersheds. The trail began with a long portage from Meductic, where Clark excavated both historic and pre-contact sites, to the Eel River, which leads up to First Eel Lake. A portage to North Lake allows access to the Chippineticook Lake system and to the St. Croix River. A portage from West Grand Lake allows access to the Penobscot watershed by way of the Bascahegan Stream and the Mattawamkeag River. Dr. Clark's collection includes numerous artifacts from points along this route. Another important waterway portage route on the east side of the St. John River provides the easiest route between the St. John and the Miramichi watersheds. This route involves a long 24-kilometer portage beginning at Bristol, up the Little Shiktahawk Stream, which is not navigable, to the vicinity of Floreston on the south branch of the southwest Miramichi River. The south branch is navigable by canoe to the main southwest Miramichi at Juniper. Dr. Clark excavated sites at both ends of this route, at Bristol and at the forks of the Miramichi. There is also potential for portage routes between the Tobic River system and the Miramichi system. For example, W.F. Gonong postulated a long portage of 27 kilometers between the Wapski branch of the Tobic and the northwest branch of the Miramichi. Dr. Clark speculated about a travel route from the Gulquack, a tributary of the Tobic, to Clearwater Brook, a headwater tributary of the southwest Miramichi. He excavated native campsites at both ends of the Gulquack-Clearwater route. However, these routes traverse areas of higher relief and rugged terrain, and may have been used much less than the Little Shiktahawk portage from the St. John to the Miramichi. Fishing and archaeology were often intertwined in Dr. Clark's life and in his writing. In reading much of his published work over the past several years, I've come to a couple of realizations. First, Clark's last three books, Six Salmon Rivers, Song of the Reel, and Someone Before Us, form a set. Each of these books presents a blend of the main obsessions of his life: reading, writing, rivers, canoes, and especially fishing and archaeology. Like the cocktails made by Clark's fishing guide, Bill, the ingredients in each book are the same, although the proportions vary. On the right, a photo of the young Dr. Clark shows him with a prize salmon catch. On the left are two of the more mysterious and anomalous of his archaeological finds, flakestone eccentrics that resemble fish hooks. These artifacts most resemble bonefish hooks made during the Archaic period, and both appear to be made from variants of Minas Basin North Mountain cherts from Nova Scotia, materials that were rarely used by Native people during the Archaic period. My second realization is that the three books, all published while Dr. Clark was in his 70s and 80s, can be seen as Clark's memoir, a memoir structured in part by the rich Maritimes tradition of comedic and folkloric tale-telling. As noted previously, Clark found his first pre-contact artifact as a teenager while duck hunting with his uncle in the Grand Lake area. However, it was an assemblage of artifacts that he found while repairing the foundation of a fishing camp near Juniper at the forks of the southwest Miramichi River in the mid-1920s that really sparked his interest in archaeological excavation and artifact collecting. These themes inspired our honors students to produce this poster in 2009. These photos show Dr. Clark excavating on the banks of the Miramichi River. The photographer, whose identity, unfortunately, is unknown, has captured the idyllic interplay of the river, the bank edge, and the fishermen that Clark often conjured so compellingly in his writing. But here, the camera has caught the fisherman with a shovel in his hand rather than a fly rod. To conclude, the University of New Brunswick is privileged to have received the donation of the George Frederick Clark Artifact Collection. For the first time, the Department of Anthropology has access to an artifact collection that can be used for teaching New Brunswick and Maritimes archaeology. This development comes at an auspicious time, as Susan Blair and I are working to expand the archaeology programs offered at UNB. In addition, we believe that the Clark Collection has considerable research potential, and expanding our understandings of pre-contact travel routes, portage systems, and fishing practices are but a few aspects of that potential. This final slide presents a brief bibliography for those who wish to learn more about Dr. Clark and his archaeological work, about Aboriginal boats, portage routes, and about the history of fly fishing.